If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Chase, I don't know if you're aware of this. You may be. Take it from me. Once the bug bites you, the musical bug bites you, it's very difficult to get rid of. So take my word for it. Ask my wife.
Yeah, ask these three.
She'll tell you.
How long you been playing chess?
About 11 months, a year.
Yeah, once the bug bites, it's difficult to let go of. I've been trying to let go of her for 40 years. If there's one thing, psychology, I don't know if anybody here, I know one person who knows some psychology, university-wise, but there's a list of priorities. Isn't that Maslow's list? Yeah, Maslow's list of priorities that every human being desires. There are certain things we all desire. And one of them is the ultimate priority, and that is that somebody, somewhere, knows everything about us, everything, and yet still wants to be in a relationship with us. Somebody knows everything, all the flaws, all the deep things that we never express to other people, but that there's somebody who really wants to stay beside us and will never abandon us no matter what. Kind of like what we commit to in a marriage, right? That's one human being that we've committed to, who we're going to say to them, and they will hopefully say back to us, you can go through a lot of changes in your life, but I'm never going to abandon you just because I'm making that choice. Let's take a look at this text and see what it would tell us in Romans chapter 8. I'll begin reading in verse 24. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope, because who hopes for what they see? But if we hope for what we don't see, we wait for it eagerly with endurance. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how we should pray, but the Spirit intercedes for us with inexpressible groanings. And the one who searches our heart, that is God, who knows the mind of His Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes on behalf of the believers according to God's will. And we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God and who are called according to God's purposes. Because those whom God foreknew, He predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. For the first, who would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Those He predestined, He also called. Those He called, He also justified. Those He justified, He also glorified. What then shall we say about these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? Indeed, He who did not spare His own Son, but gave Him up for all of us, how will He not also, along with Him, freely give us all things? Who will bring any charge against God's chosen? It is God who justifies. Who will condemn us? Christ is the one who died, and more than that, He was also raised, who is at the right hand of God and who is also interceding for us. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will trouble or distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, or sword? As it is written, for your sakes we encounter death all day long. We were considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we have complete victory through Him who loved us. For I am convinced, Paul says, that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor heavenly rulers, nor things that are present, nor things that are to come, nor powers, nor height, depth, or anything else in creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Now, there's a ton of theology in this text, and we're not going to be able to get into all of it today. But there's a theological importance I do want to spend just a minute on. And it's really found prior to the text we read in verse 22. If you read verse 22, and you can read that if you like, you'll see that there's something about the world that is absolutely true about the world, and it's not good about the world. And that is, the world is not at all as God intended it to be. Paul here, we're not as God intended us to be. The whole of history is not intended as God had intended history to be played out. since we fell in the garden, everything has been damaged. Not just us, but everything. That's why when Isaiah talks about the restoration of all things, he says, a lion will lay with a lamb, and it won't lay there to be digested. It'll just lay there with the lamb in safety. Children will play at cobras' dens and not be harmed. So there's something about everything that's been completely upset by the fact of human sin. And we're part of that. So Paul here speaks of hope. He doesn't speak of certainty. Now that makes a lot of people really nervous, the fact that Paul doesn't speak here of certainty. I remember hearing Christopher Hitchens, the great atheist, whom you may not be familiar with, but he said something that the thing he hated most about Christianity was, seek and you will find. He hated that because he said, look, if you ever crack the door open to say that God might be and you seek him, you're going to find him. He hated that because it was like some kind of coercion from someplace he didn't know from where it was coming. But this idea here with Paul, think of Paul, who Paul is. I mean, if anybody's close to the Lord, I mean, compared to me, I would pick Paul over me any day. And yet Paul says he is convinced. He has hope. He points to several different passages of Scripture that you could go and read if you like. John 7 and Matthew 7 and Revelation chapter 3 that all point to the same thing. That God is near, and if we reach out to God sincerely, we're going to find him. He's going to answer that prayer. If a person comes to God with just a tiny bit of faith that God might possibly be there, and they reach out to him, they're going to find him. He's going to be found. He's not trying to escape being found. But then there's a problem, and the problem is who we are, and that is this, that there is nothing natural to us that says we want God. That is not natural to the human condition. Paul says there's nobody who understands, nobody seeks God. So, in other words, something has to happen in us to make us even available to God. God's got to do a lot of the work. You remember Saul went before he was Paul. He's persecuting the church. He's a murderer. He's dragged Christians off because of their following of this new way that he thinks is just absolutely against Judaism. And he's dragging them off to be imprisoned. He's got papers in his hand. He's headed for Damascus. He's going to drag a bunch more off into prison. Can you imagine being in one of those families and you got these little children in the room, and Saul with the temple guard comes wading in there with spears gleaming and drags the mom and dad out because they're followers of this new way, and the children never see them again? That's Paul's job, he thinks. And yet, you see what happens to Saul in that moment when Jesus touches him. He says, "Who are you, Lord? Who are you?" He doesn't recognize any of this. He has reached the place where he has made that tiny little step of faith that says, "Who are you?" That's all God's looking for. He's looking for people to just take that tiny step and say, "If you're there, I want to know you." There's a mystery here. This mystery is the fact that we can't reach out to God until God does something in us to make us able to reach out to him. And we've all had that experience. If you're in here and you've called the name of Jesus as Lord, that experience has come to you. I can't say that I have deep awareness of the moment when that happened to me. I didn't have the experience Saul of Tarsus had. Maybe you did. I don't know. But that very moment when there was enough in me to say, "God, if you're there, I want to know you," that was the life change. That's when everything changed for me. That's when it changed for Saul. That's when it changes for everybody. And that's what makes communicating the gospel to anybody who doesn't believe so hard. Because we're communicating hope. We're not communicating certainty. Now, this is a deeply disturbing aspect of Christianity for a lot of people who don't believe, and it's disturbing also for people who do. There's something very significant here in the fact, in the same text, if you read the rest of the chapter, where Paul says God puts the Spirit in us, that calls out to God in that use of a word that in the Greek was the thing that toddlers called their father. Papa or daddy. He gives us the Spirit that calls out Abba. That's the Greek term for that toddler's way of referring to their dad. And yet, within that, we're inside of a whole universe, us included, that is groaning, awaiting the day of the Lord. The whole universe is messed up, and all of the difficulties and everything that we see going on around us, not just in human beings, but in the cosmos itself. There's no way anybody will ever convince me that a meteor strike was intended by God that kills people, or that an earthquake that buries a village in the middle of the night when they're all sleeping, which happens in South America quite frequently, was intended by God. Those things were never intended, but the cosmos is damaged now. It's groaning, and part of those groanings are those kinds of things that happen that we just can't say with any sense of reason that we understand why they happen to good people. There were probably lots of believers in some of those villages that were buried in those earthquakes. See, evil and trouble are just gratuitously present everywhere in the world. Everywhere. But in this text, there's an explanation for it. The cosmos is groaning. Everything is messed up. Nothing is the way it's supposed to be. And even you and I who have the first fruits of the Spirit, as Paul talks about in Ephesians 1, where we've got this down payment, where we know that we know that we know because God's Spirit is in us, we're still groaning too. How many funerals have you been to? Right? We're still groaning. That's why when we're at a funeral and somebody we love is laying there in the box, there's something deep inside of us that says, this is wrong. That's a child's intuition, and it's correct. It is wrong. That was never intended to happen. And this passage brings to mind the fact that we, as a universal in human nature, we don't do death very well. We just don't. We cling to our loved ones. We cling to life. We cling to all of that so tenaciously. But stop and consider what James did. James says our life is like a vapor, right? So I remember reading about, well, you can see it in almost any feed now on the internet. If you read a news feed, you'll see some famous person has just died, right? Do you think, would you remember that 6 months from now? I doubt I will. Matter of fact, there are a whole bunch of great luminaries who have come and gone that I don't really think about them ever. Guess what? A friend of mine said this to me. He said, Rip, you know the most disturbing thing, and he's got children, he said, the most disturbing thing to me is in this world that I will die and that my children will remember me. Their children, if they ever had a chance to know me, might remember me a little bit, and their children won't know me at all. It'll be as though I was never here. I remember a relative of mine who was near the end of their life who said to me that disturbed them greatly, that they'd be forgotten. And it was one of those moments where it wasn't me. It was that somehow God just gave me something, and I was so thankful. And I just said, you know, God's not forgotten you ever. He'll never forget you. So the question for me is, as we look at what Paul says here about nothing being able to separate us from the love of God, is do we really believe it? That's a big question, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, when we're down and out, when things are really rough, when we suffer, do we really believe that God is not going to abandon us? I think we misinterpret verse 28 where he says all things work together for the good of those who love God. Who's good? Whose good is it? Right? It's God's good. And we just have to lay back and trust that God's good is good, even when it doesn't look good to us. It doesn't, many times. I mean, we're praying for somebody here who's a mother of 6 who now has a brain tumor. They don't even know if she's going to live. That doesn't seem good to me. I doubt it seems good to her. Is it God's good? Might be. We don't know. That's where this walk of faith where I just say, you know, God, I don't know what's going on. I don't understand it, but I trust that you're good. And I'm going to trust that you're good and continue that. But you know, that level of good and that level of trust is the way to find the very comforts that Paul speaks about in this text. There's no shortcut to that. In other words, I might read the text, but if I've never suffered anything, or if I'm of the mindset that God's good is that I get the parking space closest to the door at Walmart every time, or that the red light's going to change to green so that I don't have to put on brakes, or whatever good thing it is that we hold as good, and yet those things don't happen, and then other things come into life that seem to strip away anything that I might say is good, then it's going to be very difficult to be comforted by words like this, because they're just going to seem like pie in the sky. I know for me, I'll confess this, I find a lot of the Psalms distant to me. But that's because I'm so earthbound. I'm so considerate of what's going on in my life. Like, my life is so important. You know, I've got to have everything lined up just so. Things have got to work out for me to make me happy and comfortable. And so when I read the Psalms, when David or whoever the psalmist is at that particular psalm talks about all the good things of being close to God, it seems kind of far away for me. But you know, that's where it comes back to the idea or the truth that at some level, we've just got to really cling to those things as true. And they are true, but they are hard to cling to sometimes, aren't they? They really are. So the good from God's perspective may not look good to us. And we've talked about this many times, but how many books do we have to read about somebody who goes through something terrible? And at the end of the book, they say, but you know, I wouldn't have known God this way had I not gone through it. This aspect of my life wouldn't be what it is had I not suffered that. There are lots of those books, and they're out there for a reason. That's those people's experience. John Newton. Oh, and another thing, think about this for just a minute before I go to John Newton. Think about all the Old Testament battles. Do you ever think about those? I mean, in terms of the cruelties, God commanding the Jews to go in and kill everything, not just the men, women, and children, not just the combatants, but the animals and everything. Was that good for them? In God's sight, it was. That tells me something about this life. It tells me that this life, while precious, is not all there is. Those people who died in those battles, the innocents, God hadn't forgotten them either. He hadn't forgotten them. John Newton was, if you know this story, you may, he was a contemporary of William Wilberforce, the primary abolitionist in England, when the whole fight between slavery and abolition was going on in England. Newton was a slave ship captain. That's what he did for a living. He took the boats over. They bought the Africans or the Ethiopians or whoever it was they were buying at that particular time, or the Arabs. They bought them, put them in the boat, hauled them across the ocean to England, and then sold them. That was his business. And he felt no pang of conscience about it at all. And then one trip he was on in his ship called the Greyhound, he said, we got into a terrible storm, and I just figured this is it. We're all going to die. And somehow in that moment of this incredibly bad storm where he figured they were lost, he called out to God, and God met him. God met him there, and he became born again he became a follower of Jesus because of that moment in that terrible storm. That's a lot of people, right? I mean, somebody that used to say, all you got to do if you want to find out what a person really believes is throw them out of an airplane at 50,000 feet, and you'll find out right quick. Before they hit the ground, they'll probably pray. Or when you're in an airplane and the pilot says, we're entering some mild turbulence. And you see everybody then becomes a believer right in the airplane when it starts to bounce around and stuff. So he was on the ship, he became born again, but he continued trading in slaves for years. And then suddenly God, this takes time, right? It takes time for God to show us things when things are wrong with us or that we're doing that are wrong. And finally, he came to the place where he realized, I can't look at people who are made in God's image when there's no slave, male nor female, Jew nor Greek, in God's sight, and yet sell these people. So he repented of the slave trade, and he became the primary advocate to urge William Wilberforce to fight the slave trade in Parliament. You know, Wilberforce, the document ending slavery in England was signed when Wilberforce was on his deathbed. It was reported to him. So Newton became kind of a Christian mystic through all this, and he wrote a really famous hymn called Faith's Review and Expectation. That's a curious title. Of course, we know it from the first line of the hymn, Amazing Grace. Some changes in us are going to be immediate, some are going to be a process, but they're all miraculous. Because we don't seek God on our own. He has to change us. All of these things are a response to the love that God has for us. Paul says, I am convinced, right? What does it take to be convinced? Let me ask you a question, you who know Jesus in this room. Could you be convinced by some really good argument that God's not in you and with you? Could a really good argument knock God out of your heart? I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible at all. All of the comfort of God's Spirit is available to us when life breaks us. All of the consolation when we lose somebody we love. All of the ability to go on when life doesn't look worth living. I remember reading just this week of a person, a model. She was like 38. Working in TV, wealthy, had everything going, had a family. And she had COVID a couple of years ago, but it created health considerations in her that she just felt like life wasn't worth living anymore. And she went over to the Netherlands where euthanasia is legal and had herself put down, so to speak. And I thought, what a tragedy, you know, that if she had known the Lord, I doubt very seriously she would have done that. Because, you know, God promises things to us, and when God promises, He promises by nothing greater. He can't promise by anything greater than Himself. So when He promises, the promise is certain. And if I take God's hand and God asks me to jump, I can be confident He's going to hold my hand and jump with me. The Spirit of God is the promise that God gives us, just like Paul says, in that we then become convinced. Convinced. We're given first-hand knowledge that the Lord is with us and will never leave us. And Jesus said this, then I'll ask the Father and He'll give you another advocate to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth, whom the world can't accept because it doesn't see Him or know Him. But you know Him because He resides with you and will be in you. Paul asks us all in this room the question, do you not know that you are God's temple and God's Spirit lives in you? I don't know where everybody is today, but if I say